birth, death, taxes, the international break when you just don't want it. Some things in life are guaranteed. And another thing that's guaranteed is another episode of Talk of the Trinity podcast. Welcome to the Talk of the Trinity podcast. I'm Baz Barrett. With me is Will Forrest as always. You've found us during the week on the Twitter page at Talk Trinity, on the YouTube channel at Talk Trinity, on Spotify somewhere. If you type in Talk of the Trinity, you will eventually get to us. We are on Amazon. I forgot to plug that last time, but we have turned up on Amazon. And by the time you're listening to this, there may be some other good and not so good media channels that you will be able to listen to these dulcet tones. So like eating your greens before you have your dessert, we got to get through Spurs review first. Then we'll be moving on to the moment we've all been waiting for, our pick for the strikers in the Ultimate 11 that's been following for all the other weeks so far. All the other spaces are filled. And we'll also be sprinkling in our thoughts about the season so far, how we think it's gone, and where we think it might be going after the international break is over, or the latest in a long line of international breaks, it seems. Though, speaking of international breaks, it will give us some time to try and get over events that happened on Sunday at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. On paper, you would have read this as Spurs 2, Villa 1. But for those who listen to the podcast will know that it was actually Buck's revenge. He sucked us in good. If you were listening last week, you know, even I thought Villa were going to win. I mean, that was the optimism that was flowing through the veins as a result of Buck's lament as regards how Spurs were doing. They looked all right to me. Well, in terms of Sunday, what were your thoughts?
I'll be honest with you. I had a horrible feeling in the pit of my stomach as soon as you said, yeah, I think we'll win this weekend. Because
yeah, I thought so too.
Yeah, you can be a bit of a pessimistic fucker at times.
Yeah, that's on my business card.
It's one of those, isn't it, where it shows really the testament of the team that we all felt that we would get a win against Tottenham. We didn't think we'd get a draw. We felt we'd get a win against Tottenham, a team who have been established for a number of years now, have been really where we should have been. We should have kicked on and stayed there after the O'Neill days, really. All right, yeah, O'Neill left under a bit of a cloud and things didn't go great, but we had the players available to kick on if we'd have had the right ownership and management. So to think we should be getting a win is a positive. Unfortunately, we didn't really turn up after the first 10 minutes against Tottenham. It was nice that Ollie Watkins got a goal, but there were a few mistakes. I mean, you look at the free kick that Harry Kane nearly scored from the halfway line, and you thought, blinking out, this isn't going to be a very good day at the office for us.
No, I mean, I think in terms of modern football, you can spend hours and hours analysing a game and positions taken by players or not taken and kind of the tactics employed. But sometimes just a good old-fashioned simple explanation, as you put there, we didn't turn up. And that was basically it. I mean, I'd say continuing on my positive streak that I have recently, I think the fact, I know, it's got, at least this won't affect this particular comment because it's already happened. I think the fact we were that bad and we only lost 2-1 against Spurs, I think is a positive, because I'm sure in the past, a bad Villa performance would have ended up with us on the receiving end of a cricket score. So that's one positive. I'm scraping, to continue the glass half full analogy. But in terms of what happened on the day, I mean, it's disappointing in terms of we didn't play very well. I don't think Spurs were great. I suppose there was an element of they'd been criticised, well, as demonstrated by their own fans, in terms of what happened the previous week against Arsenal. You're expecting that there was perhaps always going to be a reaction to that. And it was, for Spurs, a situation where I think the international break for them has come at the wrong time, because they could have built on that momentum, having got that win that they needed. And, in terms of roughly in the same place in the table, Villa and Spurs, fairly even game on Sunday between teams who, for different reasons and having come to their current positions via very different routes, they're roughly even, I would say. So that's a positive. If we would have turned up, we would have won. But unfortunately, we didn't.
Yeah, you're right. There is the positive there that wasn't the greatest performance, and yet we only lost 2-1. I mean, it's very easy, isn't it, as a Villa fan, to fall down the rabbit hole of despair as soon as we don't get the result that we wanted. You look at the previous conversation we had in that international break, when there were a lot of fans that wanted Dino out because half of our first team and reserves had drew 1-1 with Brentford, who had just come up to the Premier League and beaten Arsenal in their first game, then got a point away at Palace, who were a respectable Premier League team. They've been in the Premier League for quite a while now. And I'll be honest with you, I probably have lost a shoe down that rabbit hole, and I'm trying to fish it out. So there's that bit of negativity. Because when you hear Ollie Watkins' interview after the game, and I imagine you'll agree with me with this, he went, we'd have taken a point before the game. I don't think we would have. I don't think a point was ever in our remit, and I don't think it ever is in our remit as a team. I feel that every game we play, Dean Smith believes that we can win, whether that's because of our set pieces or whether it's because tactically we are a very good side, regardless of the formation that we play usually.
I think maybe if that was a widespread belief in the team beforehand, that it would have taken a draw. Maybe in terms of the shifting expectations, whether right or wrong, hasn't maybe perhaps quite caught up with kind of what the squad are realistically thinking. I mean, I wouldn't have thought so. I mean, in terms of they've been making all the right noises to date, in terms of we're looking to push on this season, even despite the loss of, a player who made it into the ultimate Villa 11. I mean, what greater acknowledgement you can get from that. And, it was watching him on Sunday afternoon playing false 9 at Liverpool. I'm sure he would have preferred to be collecting his trophy from us. But in terms of if it was a decision to take a point, I mean, I'd be slightly concerned if that was the widespread attitude. But what I'd be more concerned about, and we touched upon this after reviewing the Man United game, and with the preface that it's still a bit too early. And again, I still say it's a bit too early. But those noises about Watkins and Ings as a partnership grew a little louder after Sunday, in terms of, obviously Watkins got his first goal of the season, but they haven't scored in the same game together. And there was moments watching it on Sunday whereby it didn't quite look like that they were both able to perform to the best of their ability or in the position that they would prefer to at the same time. It seemed to be one having to sacrifice to the other, which, I mean, depending on what type of partnership you are in life, you might say, what's the deal about that? That's what happens. But it doesn't seem quite yet that they're getting the best out of each other. That's me bringing it back to the negative side. But what are your thoughts on that? Too early to tell? Are the signs more promising for you?
Definitely too early to tell. I mean, the one thing that you could point out is that both of Ings' goals have come in games where he's played up front on his own. But Watkins has now scored in that partnership. Danny Ings got the pre-assist, if that's even a thing, really, for the Watkins goal. And he's carried on creating chances. I read a stat earlier in the week that they linked up more against Tottenham than they have done in their previous two matches playing up front with each other. So that's a positive at the very least. Danny Ings has got to get used to really getting into the box and maybe not dropping off as much as he is doing for Watkins. I think, well, I mentioned before, Watkins is going to be our striker who scores from the goal line to the 6-yard box penalty spot. Danny Ings is going to be that 6-yard box to the edge of the box type of striker. Ings is used to playing in a 2. Watkins isn't. Watkins is used to playing up front on his own or out wide on the left. And maybe Watkins is a little bit more selfish than Danny Ings, and he just needs to learn to release the ball a little bit quicker. I think we pointed out, didn't we, against Man United when he took that heavy touch when he was running through at Varane, managed to get the ball back under control, went round him, went past a couple of players and shot at De Gea, when really all he had to do was roll the ball off to the right for Ings to take a touch. And you'd back Danny Ings to score from that sort of an angle, regardless of the team that you're playing against. You know, he's one of the top strikers of the Premier League over the last 3 years, and that was in the Southampton side, who are sort of similar to us, but they haven't really set the world on fire or got the big results that we have, or not that I can remember. I'm confident that we'll be fine with them in the end. The international break has come at a bit of a bad point, I suppose, with Ollie Watkins now going to England for a week or two to play with the national team. Great for him, obviously. But if he'd have stayed behind, maybe him and Watkins could have worked on this just a little bit more. And then the other thing they need to get right as well is knowing who those midfield 3 are going to be. Because is Leon Bailey going to come into the centre, maybe play behind the 2 strikers? Will Emi Buendia play there? Or is he going to go with McGinn, Louise and Ramsey? It seems when it's those 3, it's very much a flat 3 across the midfield. Whereas when you've got Buendia or Bailey in there, maybe even Traore in there, it's a bit more of a triangle. It becomes a bit more like a 5-2-1-2. So there's a few things to figure out. Maybe they need a game against a team who are languishing near the bottom, get a goal each and really kick on from there. But it could be a month or 2 before we really see the benefits of the 2 of them playing up together. But the next month of fixtures and the month after that, probably good games for them to start hitting it off, really. And I'm still confident that they'll both get 10 to 15 goals this season. I mean, there's been 7 games. We've still got another 31. You know, it's not all doom and gloom yet. What about you? Are you confident of the partnership, or do you think it's going to be one where we just revert back to having one striker, or shoehorning them both into a 4-3-3 with one of them moving out wide, or a 4-2-3-1 with one of them in the 10?
Well, I think it was rather careless of Ollie Watkins to get called up for the England squad. He should have been taking alternative steps to avoid that. So he could have been spending 2 weeks at Collymore Heath. I'd say in terms of whether we're going to persist with playing them both together up front, or whether the system will go back to one up front and having to shoehorn one of them. I think if we were going to do the shoehorn option, it would be Ings on his own up front and Watkins on the wing. But then you run into that, I say problem, it's a nice problem to have in terms of, you mentioned in terms of the 3 we're playing in centre midfield, if we're playing the current shape, McGinn, Louise, Ramsey. I quite like that as a 3, to be honest. In terms of you're going to bring Buendia into that centre midfield, I agree he's going to be pushing further forwards, so that will turn into more of a triangle. But in terms of you said it is more of a flat three. I'd probably say in terms of Luiz, probably maybe sits slightly deeper and Ramsey goes slightly further forward just because in his youthful abandon, he likes running up towards the opposition goal. It does allow kind of, when you just mentioned those couple of players who aren't in the starting 11, one because he's not being picked and the other because he's injured, does demonstrate the flexibility tactically that we've got. If we are going to stick with 3-5-2 ahead of the next game, which we won't go into too much detail because that'll be part of our preview show nearer the time. The more interesting decision for me is whether Target or Bailey will play, whether we'll play Bailey as a left wing back. I think that'll be interesting to see because I think Bailey in certain games, and we've got it's home game against Wolves. That's not a spoiler alert. I think he can be quite effective, but we'll leave talk of Wolves aside for another day. In terms of Watkins and Ings, I think it's going to take time. I mean, I'd say in terms of if you're going to change the shape and put Watkins on the wing, does he even get in the team based on that? And then it's difficult in terms of you spend the money on Danny Ings. I don't think he's going to really accept being on the bench for very long. I don't think Watkins is going to accept being on the bench for very long, especially if he's being called up to the England squad. So there is an element of, well, we've got to make it work. And what I see in terms of, you were mentioning in terms of the stats show that there is an improvement in terms of, kind of the connectivity. It's not quite been translated into the naked eye test yet, but it doesn't strike me as being a position whereby one's ego is bigger than the other in terms of one is going to demand kind of the central role and the other's going to have to bow down to. It does strike me that they will work on it as a partnership. And as you said, hopefully the run of games that we've got coming up will assist with getting a few more opportunities. So as we've said previously, it's definitely something to keep an eye on. But, as you said, we're 7 games in, 31 to go. I think it's a bit early to be writing it off as a failure. They're both good players. You just got to hope with a bit more time. I mean, obviously Watkins was injured at the start of the season, so they haven't had 7 games together. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not unduly concerned just yet. But, of course, if it does end up being a position at the end of the season, Captain Hindsight's coming out and then saying, oh, well, we definitely saw this coming a mile off. I would say in terms of decisions of the starting 11, it was probably, it was literally the team that I thought it was going to be just because of the mantra of you don't change a winning team. I suppose the only potential contention is probably stretching a bit. Courtney Hawes plays at the back instead of Trinity. What did you think of that decision?
Understandable. And given Courtney Hawes' confidence from that fantastic slide tackle that he did against Lukaku in the Carabao Cup and also the match-winning performance against Man United, you wouldn't drop him, would you? He's earned his way into the team. He played very well in that game. He did everything that was asked of him against Man United. He even threw in a penalty for them. Though I appreciate that was more of a bounce, a very unlucky penalty to concede, really. He deserved his spot. But now, I think with a defeat, despite how good players are playing, it gives you the opportunity to reset and really establish and go, okay, well, our next game's Wolves, which is going to be the starting 11 that beats them. And you look at the players who you're likely to play against, we'll review it more closer to the time, but there's a lot more pace in that Wolves team than there is in that Tottenham team. So maybe Twanzebe is a better shout there. I think if you were looking at our best team in general in a 3-5-2, I think we both agree that you'd put Axel into that back three ahead of anybody else except for Konsa and Mings, wouldn't you, really?
When he's on form, it's one of those chicken and egg scenarios of people don't get into form unless you play them. But it's always a bit of a risk just throwing somebody into a team consistently who hasn't played. And Twanzebe didn't play really last season, and he's played a couple of games with Villa. So in terms of if you are going to do it, playing in a back three, Chelsea first goal aside, is probably the best formation to kind of get yourself into match fitness, as it were, because at least you've got a couple of mates covering you from side to side. But yeah, it was interesting in terms of Tuanzebe, and you don't know how much of it is true, how much was paper talk in terms of wanting to sign, or would be minded, I think it's probably as far as we can put it, to sign a permanent deal in the summer. You would have to think, realistically speaking, he would only sign one and we'd only offer him one if he was a regular in the team. So it'd be interesting to see how that goes during the course of the season, because we had Ross Barkley last year. There was talk after his electric start that we would be interested. Didn't work out for him, and he slowly got edged out of the first team picture near the end of the season when it appeared from the outside that Dean Smith had made his mind up that Barkley wasn't a long-term feature in his plans. So didn't really give him too many opportunities from that stage. It'd be interesting to keep an eye on Tuanzebe to see if he is playing regularly, whether that is with a permanent deal for both parties in mind. So yeah, in terms of Tuanzebe, Hawes, I mean, I can see why we played Courtney Hawes. You played a form player in that scenario. Wouldn't have done much for his confidence to be dropped after the performance of Man United, but you've got a couple of weeks for an international break. You can, if Tuanzebe is the first choice, then you would expect to be eased in after the international break. So we will see what happens in respect to that in a couple of weeks' time, and hopefully nobody picks up any injuries in respect of that. So I don't really want to talk too much more about Spurs. I mean, it was a pretty depressing afternoon. But You mentioned earlier in terms of the teams we've played so far this season and how that compares to the start and where we are after 7 games, 10th place, 10 points. You look at the teams we've played, and just going from the top of the table to the bottom, you've got Chelsea, who are top, Man United, who are 4th, Everton, who are 5th, Brentford, who are 7th, and Spurs, who are 8th. So out of 7 games we've played, 5 are for teams above us. Then the only 2 we've played who are below us are Watford, who sat the manager, which did demonstrate. We got caught cold on the opening day. I think, go back and listen to the Watford review if you dare. And then we've got Newcastle, who, to be honest, we all knew were terrible before the season. And, we got the win, and comfortably so, and comfortably expected. But in terms of the teams who we've played who are above us in the league, with the exception of Brentford, who have had a good start, but I think there is sometimes the honeymoon period for a promoted team. They get the points early on when teams aren't quite sure about them because they just haven't played them before, especially with Brentford not having been in the top flight in the Premier League era and a bit before that. The other teams above us who we played, Chelsea, Man United, Everton, and Spurs, you can make an argument that before the start of the season, if you're going to plot your league table, all of them you'd put above us in terms of depending on the pundit. So when you look at it in that way, we have had quite a tricky start. The Brentford game, we had injuries just before, and pullouts, which didn't help. So in terms of reviewing the season so far, or kind of initial thoughts, I'd say when looked at in that context, we're roughly where I thought we'd be in terms of the overall season. I thought we'd be about 10th mid-table. And you look at the teams that we've played, you could make the argument that we're overachieving, in terms of some of those teams we played. I would say we're roughly where you think we'd be. And, you can take, we should have beat Watford, but you can translate that to, we probably would have lost against Man United most seasons. So I think it roughly evens itself out. And I think we're roughly where I thought we were going to be, where we should be. So nothing really to see here. What are your thoughts?
I think you hit the nail on the head, to be honest with you. You'd have expected a win against Watford, but you'd have expected a defeat against Man United. The only other thing is with Brentford, as you say, if we hadn't have had those injuries, would we have beaten them with our best team? Yeah, I think we would have. I think we'd have beaten them quite comfortably as well, maybe 3 or 4-1, if I'm being completely honest. Tottenham, you don't expect to go to Tottenham and win all of the time. But as we said, we're a positive bunch now with the way that we've been playing. We thought that we could get something against Chelsea. You know, it's a good season. We're doing very well. If Joe Bloggs had come up to you off the street before the season and said, look, you can have a podcast, and on top of that, you can play 5 teams who are going to be above you by the second international break, and you can get 7 points from them. The 5 teams that you're going to play are going to be the teams that we have done. You'd probably be actually thinking, oh, okay, well, we'll probably be about 14th or 15th when you hear that Brentford are above you. But they've done extraordinarily well. A new team coming up, they've lit the touch paper and they're gone. They're away. They've only lost 1 game all season, which is testament to them. But this isn't a Brentford podcast. This is Villa podcast. If you'd have been happy with it, and then if you'd have found out, oh, by the way, you'll be 10th with 10 points, you would have been very happy. You find out which teams are below you, and you think that, okay, we've got a bit of a different opinion with Arsenal. But Arsenal, Wolves, Leicester, Leeds being below us, you'd have thought, wow, yeah, I'll take that. I'd start the season, I thought Everton may finish around about the same position as us. I'd like to think that we can finish above them. But they've only lost 1 game this season. Man United have only lost 1 game this season. We're coming for teams. We're doing very well. And by the time we get to the international break after this one, or by the time we get to the start of December, I'd hope that we'd be in touch and distance of the top 7, that Europa Conference League as well. As we are at the moment, we're actually only 6 points off top. Okay, we're 7 points off the relegation zone, but I don't think we need to look over our shoulders. Someone says to you again, you can be comfortably mid-table, you've beaten Man United, you've beaten Everton, okay, you've lost to a newly promoted team, and you've also lost to the league leaders. By the way, you've also sold Jack Grealish and brought in 5 players who need to bed into the team, because all of them, realistically on their day, are first team starters. I think Ashley Young is as well. Then you'd have taken being 10th at the moment, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, if you're doing the very unscientific, let's count up the goals that we scored and count the goals we conceded and see where that puts us. In terms of goals scored on 10, that's 7th in the league, equal with Brentford. In terms of goals conceded, 9, that puts us 9th in terms of goals conceded, and 10 in terms of points puts us 10th. So with that very unscientific analysis aside, yeah, I mean, it's where to be expected. And, you know, everybody has a tendency, you know, you try and pick individual games and, oh, you should have won here, you should have won there. And you pick games in a group of 3. I mean, in terms of the first 3 games of the season, there was a 4, we could win all of them, or we could at least get 7 points. There was the last 3 games we've just played where there was a feeling, we might lose all of them. So you do group them, consciously or not. And you look in terms of, we're going to do exactly the same thing now. We're going to look in terms of our next 6 games. Not going into too much of an in-depth preview of each of them, but just to kind of continue some of the themes we've just been talking about there. We've got Arsenal next, who are below us in the table. Oh no, we haven't. We got Wolves first. I mean, I'm just thinking straight on Sky. So let's rewind that a bit. We got Wolves first, who are below us. We got Arsenal, who are below us. West Ham, who are above us. Southampton, who are below us. Brighton, who are above us, and Palace, who are below us. So there's a feeling that and then we got Man City, who are they're okay, I guess. So you're looking in terms of the next 6. There's going to be the tendency to say, oh, that's a slightly easier run. I mean, I think there's challenges in all of those games that we'll come on to in more detail. But I do think it is, one of those old cliches in football. Just got to play one game at a time and believe in what you're doing. I mean, Wolves, we'll do it in the preview close to the time. They picked up some form in the last couple of weeks. So that's going to be a difficult game. And also, it's not quite a local derby, but, they're a local team. So it always has a bit of edge to that. Arsenal Friday Night Lights. I mean, we'll be having some comments about Arsenal when that comes. I mean, you've already had a few in terms during the course of this season. And then West Ham, just to conclude it, they're a team very similar to us historically in the Premier League, roughly been at the same level, not necessarily at the same time, but, in terms of teams who've been challenging Europe, been relegated, had those middle seasons. So we do have more links with West Ham than perhaps meets the eye, apart from the colours, which is the first thing that sees the eye. So I'd say in terms of where we are for the season to date, it puts us in a decent nick to go forward to the next few games. And, I mean, in terms of you're always not going to be able to satisfy everybody all of the time, apart from if you listen to this podcast, because we satisfy everybody all of the time with our great Villa content.
Ooh,
I don't.
Yeah.
I don't. So it's seamless. Some would say. We've touched upon it previously. I don't think there's really been enough that I've seen to seriously consider changing course at this stage in terms of management or anything else. I think we're looking all right. We're doing what we roughly where we thought we'd be. The youth team continue to smash everybody who comes into their way. So, yeah, going into international break, number 2 of 48 of the season. I'm feeling all right to continue the positive theme that we have.
So I'm expecting us to be in the relegation zone then now by the time of the next international break.
Yeah, next international break. I'm with the banner outside Villa Park going Smith out. So.
I'll be with a banner outside your house saying Barrett out. I think I'm confident looking at those games, and it's going to be quite nice because out of those 6 teams that we've got 4 of the opposition fans who are going to be on the podcast talking to us about how they don't want to play the Villa because they're worried about how good we are. I think we'll get at least 8 points, if not 11, out of those games. And that might seem a bit low, but at the moment, my thinking is you get a point against Wolves, you get a point at Palace. I think we beat teams like Southampton and Brighton, and then we get a win somewhere against Arsenal or West Ham. I don't fear anybody. The trickiest game out of all of those will probably be West Ham at home, But there's definitely no need for any of this Smith out chatter. It rears its ugly head after every time we don't beat a team that we expect to beat. But the thing is, nowadays, our expectations are higher. It's very, very easy to forget that 5 or 6 years ago, we were in the Championship. We'd just gone down. A year later, we very nearly went bust. We nearly became FC Villa of Aston, And then we got promotion with new owners. We nearly sold Grealish a number of times. We stayed up by the skin of Jack Grealish's teeth at the end of that first Premier League season. And last year, there were no worries at all about relegation after the first few games. We worried that we had Sheffield United who'd done well. The previous season, we worried that we'd got Liverpool, that we'd got Leicester, that we'd got whoever we played in the second match of the season. I can't really remember the bozos. But it's remarkable to see how far we've come. And a lot of the better stuff is because of Dean Smith as our head coach and the team that he's built around him. It's very easy to forget as well that McPhee and Danks are new. They came in a couple of weeks before the start of the season. You can't expect them to walk in and know everything about everybody straight away. they're still learning themselves. These 2 weeks are going to do them the world of good to work with the players, work on new set pieces, work on new formations. Danks, for one, likes having 2 strikers. He, when he was in the England setup, he played 4-4-2, different to what we're playing at the moment. But he'll get the best out of those 2 up front. Smith will as well. How many players has Dean Smith signed that we've honestly thought he hasn't improved? Off the top of my head, I can't think of any. I'm sure there probably are 1 or 2. But all of them, you would pretty much say, they're a better player than they were before. Courtney Howes is. Tyrone Mings is. Esri Konsa most definitely is. And on top of that, he's bringing through young players such as Jacob Ramsey, who's been outstanding at the start of this season. And I'm under no illusions that I don't think Ramsey will drop off at some point during the middle of the season. And it'll be interesting to see how Dean Smith manages that. All young players tend to have a period where they go a little bit quieter. But he's proved time and time again that he knows how to get the best out of these players. I mean, for example, when we signed Matty Target, I rolled my eyes and thought 18 million, what a waste on a left back if you're spending 18 million. But he's proved to be a very good left back, a very good left wing back. And there's talks about him for England as well. Dean Smith, for me, is the man. And who else are you going to bring in? Who else would want to come? Well, I think a lot of people would want to come to us at the moment. But who would want to leave a project that we actually think, you know what, they'd be a good enough manager to push us forward, where we're actually improving on what we've got?
Yeah, I mean, it's very easy to jump on a bandwagon. But if you don't know where it's going, then it's a pretty dangerous place to be. And I agree with what you said. I wouldn't even be contemplating getting rid of Dean Smith unless you've got somebody lined up unless you've got Thomas Tuchel lined up, then yeah, it just because, you've had a bad day at the office or a few bad days at the office, I wouldn't even be thinking about getting rid of him. Or be thinking about it and then quickly discarding it. So it's positive, I'd say, overall. But
definitely. I mean, you're not going to get a Diego Simeone at the moment because we're not that big of a club that are constantly challenging in the top half of the league, the top European spaces. And I wouldn't want Simeone at the moment because Smith's doing a very good job. That's not me being a rose-tinted glasses Villa fan. The other people who have been mentioned, and I'll be honest, have been mentioned by me as well on Twitter, Potter and Hasenhüttl, they're not better than Smith. Potter's doing well at Brighton at the moment, but Brighton will finish below us this season, guaranteed. I think Dean Smith is very, very close to having us pushing for Europe. And we said it, I'm sure it was the last podcast, 2 more signings in January, and you'd expect us to get top 8, which is fine because that's pushing for Europe. I said Twanzebe as a permanent. Yeah, still think that we probably need somebody else as well, defensive cover-wise, potentially. And then a striker, I think I said Chris Wood last time, didn't I? But playing on FIFA, yeah, okay, it's not the be-all and end-all for transfers. But you go and get someone in the Championship who's done it in the Premier League and likes a bit of hustle and bustle and could play up front in a 2, Alexander Mitrovic, I think you'd be quite confident that you've got a team that are knocking on the door. And we already are quite confident in that. We just need to show that we can carry on beating these teams. We need to show that we're Aston Villa and we should be beating or getting results from teams like Man United. We should be getting results off the likes of Arsenal, off Tottenham, Wolves, Everton, and go into the Etihad and trying to play to win, whether that's through tactical counter-attacking, whether it's through winding Jack Grealish up by telling him how beautiful and pretty he is, or whether it's just going full throttle at them and high pressing. We're Aston Villa. We've come to believe now that we can achieve. They converted you, mate. Dean Smith, to me, deserves a knighthood for just getting you so positive.
Yeah, but in terms, to say I'm positive in terms, I think I'm going to come 10th, which is, you say in terms of 2 signings. I'd take 2 signings next summer, then to real quality signings in the summer to look to a real push towards Europe next season, because we'd have them, assuming we haven't sold anybody, because then we'd have a much more sustainable squad. Youngsters are going to have more experience, and I think we'll be set for the long term. In terms of Mitrovic, I would have agreed with you up until last season. I think the fact that he did nothing for Fulham last year makes me a little hesitant in terms of seeing him banging them into the Championship. Seems to be, I wouldn't have said the Championship was his level and he couldn't cut it in the Premier League. Maybe if Fulham do get promoted, he may show that last season was a blip. But yeah, I think in January, unless the player is available on a decent deal, funny enough, like we got with Sanson, actually,
yeah,
I'd wait till the summer. But, you know, I'm positive. I'm in it for the long-term view. It makes a change from, you know, reading about going bust next week. So anything's better than that.
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely. Onwards and upwards.
We've been looking into the future in respect of how we think Villa will be going between the next international breaks. But now we're going to go into the final installment of our regular series in our Ultimate 11. And we've come to talk about the strikers. We filled the other spaces in the team sheet in terms of our Ultimate 11 as opposed to the fans' Ultimate 11. We've been largely the same. We've got different goalkeepers. How did the fans vote in respect to left midfield, Will? Did they agree with us on Grealish, or have they gone with Ashley Young?
Well, let me tell you, it was quite an intense 24 hours of voting that actually resulted in a second vote having to be put forward. So we said, tell us who you think between Ashley Young, Jack Grealish. We also threw in Tony Daly as well, and myself, if you remember. So there were 78 votes, probably a little bit less than we'd normally get, but still a great number. And thank you to everybody who did vote. 10% of those votes, and not all of them made by me, so at least 7.8 people, was for me to play on the left wing. Now, people obviously haven't seen me play on the left wing for a while, but those of you who did probably remember me from my school days when I was absolutely fantastic. 26% Tony Daly, then joint with 32% each was Ashley Young and Jack Grealish. So had to put the vote out again. And it wasn't for as long. The next time it was only for a few hours between Jack Grealish and Ashley Young. There were 47 votes. We had a comment of somebody saying, well, if you don't vote for Jack Grealish, you don't know anything about football. Everyone's obviously entitled to their opinion, and I think a lot of people would agree with that opinion. In fact, 60% of the people agreed with that opinion. So as you mentioned before, the only difference that we have got so far is Emi Martinez compared to our pick of Mark Bosnich in goal. So Jack Grealish has stayed in the hearts of a lot of Villa fans and made it into our Ultimate 11 in that left midfield position.
Well, I'm glad we got an odd number of people voting second time round. Otherwise, that would have been fun if it would have been another tie. But Grealish makes his way onto the left wing in the 4-4-2 formation that we Mike Bassett style have insisted upon. So you mentioned there's only one difference between our team and the fans team. That was in goal. They went for Martinez. We went for Mark Bosnich. Then the rest of the team, Steve Staunton, Olaf Melberg, Paul McGrath, Mark Delaney, Jack Grealish, Gareth Barry, Ian Taylor, James Milner. So mass fans will tell you we got 2 places left in terms of to fill in the strikers role. Just to give a brief overview again for those who are listening for the first time and for those who switched off during this bit previously, quick overview of how we do this. We start from 1992, split into 3 decades of 10-year periods. So 92, 93 to 01, 02, 02, 03 to 2011, 2012, then 2012, 13 to 21, 22. We pick 1 or 2 players from each of those decades as our picks for that decade. And then depending on how we want to do it, we usually do a few more for the double vote. We put 4, 6 up to the Twitter sphere to vote on who they want in their ultimate 11 after we have decided who we are having in ours. So the only real stipulations are loan players don't count. You have to have played permanently for Villa, although you do get an honourable mention if you deserve one. If you don't deserve one, you don't get one. And also in terms of if you've been considered for one position on the Ultimate 11 seriously, you don't get another crack somewhere else, which off the top of my head doesn't really apply to strikers. And there was only a couple where it applied for in previous positions, but I think we managed to avoid too much controversy in relation to those. So we'll see if we are able to continue that rich streak of non-controversial form over the next however many minutes of delicious description that we are going to go through. And that was a mouthful that I thought up on the sly. We're going to go straight in 92, 93, 01, 02. I mean, for all of them, there's a lot of strikers we could talk about. So we're going to have to try and be concise as we possibly can. I suspect I know where you may go for your pick. So we're going to see if you're going to throw me a curveball or whether you are going to take the delicious lob that I'm throwing up there. Who is your pick for the first decade in terms of, we'll go for who your first choice striker would be. Who would be your number one?
Well, from my calculations, there's 17 strikers from this period that we could realistically pick. And there's quite a few honourable mentions. I won't go through those at the moment. There's a lot of duds as well there. There's maybe one player who became a bit more relevant in next decade as well. But for me, thinking about the decade that they really became prominent or they really did their best in, there's probably 3 here that you choose from, if I'm being harsh. I'm not going to go for the one that I think you think I will go for. I'm going to leave that one to you. I think you know who you might go for. I'm actually going to go for a gentleman who has got Villa in his veins. According to him, he's in the bricks and mortar at Villa Park. He was a good £5.75 million and £1 signing at the time. He joined from local rivals who said he can only leave for a bid in excess of 5.75 million. So Deadly Doug, being Deadly Doug, offered them that plus £1.
Yep. Deadly Doug contributed the £1 and the 5.75 we had to go and get from the bank probably.
No, he didn't contribute any of it, to be honest with you. He found £1 on the floor. But yeah, I think you're right. The player came in and made an instant impact, so much so he scored 2 on his debut in front of the whole end, went away and got a hat-trick at the Dell. And then John Gregory said, well, if he doesn't score 4 against Liverpool, then I'm selling him. Dion Dublin, what a player for the Villa. Those 7 goals in those first 3 games, he was fantastic. He put his body literally on the line for us. He broke his neck playing for the Claret and Blue. Came back, and on his first game back, Guzan scores an overhead kick. you sort of think in my days, is there anything he wouldn't do for the Villa? Yeah, he probably wouldn't go in defence. You're wrong. He ended up playing in defence and marking Wayne Rooney, some big up-and-coming Everton hotshot, out of the game. He was a fantastic player for us, always talks fondly about us now. And he had many a good season leading the line, scoring goals, and none more so really than the penalty against Bolton that saw us through to the FA Cup final that we won't talk about, but also that brace against Arsenal when we were 2-0 down at half-time and we beat them 3-2. So for me, for your consideration, I'm putting forward Dion Dublin.
I think that is a solid choice. And if we were picking a nice guys 11, then he's definitely going in it. But it's probably, fighting for the captaincy. I remember when we brought Saunders. Well, I'm skipping ahead there. I remember when we brought Dublin, there was a, similar to Saunders, there was a feeling of getting a player, a real statement signing. Coventry had been obviously struggling nearer the bottom end of the table, but they began to get themselves a decent team together, like late 90s Coventry. They had some good players. We knew they were good because we ended up buying a couple, including Dublin. And as he said, he really hit the ground running when he joined. And that team, round about the turn of the century, just before then. I mean, you got to look at it realistically speaking. That was the last team that Villa had that was in a title race. Not for very long, and not really after Christmas, but a couple of great starts to seasons, of which Dublin was very much in the thick of it, as it were. And, we won't talk about the cup final, but a very solid team that we had, and he was certainly part of that. So, attitude, you mentioned, bang on. I mean, in terms of, centre-back, kind of colossus when he played there, kind of in terms of that period. And he invented the doob. I mean, a player who invents their own instrument. I mean, he can play his own theme tune, like when he comes on. If he does make the Ultimate 11, when he's inaugurated, his own theme tune on his own instrument. I mean, that does warrant some serious consideration. So, I'd say
he'll present it as well, Baz. He'll present as well for us.
Yeah, I mean, especially if he brings like a hammer from Homes Under the Hammer, I think this shows Ryan itself, really. I mean, maybe there's a lesson that we should stop making our shows unscripted. But in terms of Dublin, I think he's definitely up there in terms of the 90s considerations. I mean, you had him top 3. I had him top 4. So definitely up in that similar level. In terms of the landmine that you danced around after I seductively left it there for you, I think the player who most people might be thinking of from the 90s would be Dwight York. And I'll go there. I mean, you look in terms of the numbers, it's funny, really, because there were 2 great seasons, relatively speaking, they had. Then there was a bit of a drop-off. And then there was John Gregory going to get a shotgun. Things kind of escalated fairly quickly in that regard. I mean, 95-96 was his best season for Villa. 25 goals, 48 in all competitions, 6 in the League Cup. See, we won the League Cup, so we can talk about that cup final. 17 in the league, came 4th. So in terms of performance, I mean, 4th was the highest. We haven't come higher than 4th since then. So he is ingrained with that kind of achievement, and the last time we won a cup. So gets ticks for that. In terms of, we've mentioned a few players who reputations have suffered after leaving Villa. Some have been rehabilitated. We talked about Barry getting into our Ultimate 11. Young, close to getting into the Ultimate 11, but didn't leave under particularly good terms. York, even though it's been 25 years nearly since he left, reputation isn't up there. I mean, he keeps linking himself to the Villa job every time it comes up, but there's no real clamour I don't think amongst fans anybody who's had no experience in management, you're probably not entirely sure about anyway. But I don't think that redemption story is complete. I don't think it is going to be complete. I think the best that you're going to get is, he was a good player. He had some good seasons for us, but I think he is going to be more associated, well, especially with Man United fans, but also with Villa fans, with Man United. I mean, he left because he wanted to go and win trophies. First season he leaves, wins the Champions League. So, in terms of sometimes you just well beat. and in terms of 8 goals in 11 Champions League appearances, that was his best ever return for Man United in the Champions League. Just everything worked out well for him that first season at United, and he wasn't too badly home after that. But I mean, he left for reasons. You can never really be particularly happy with somebody who in effect goes on strike to try and get a move, although he's not the only player who's done that or we've encouraged. So I'd say in terms of, you think about moments in terms of players, and they're the ones that get you on the edge of your seat, even regardless of whether they're the best player or not. There's not really too many for me with York that kind of step out on my mind, being totally honest. I mean, did he score a Panenka against Sheffield United in the Cup? I think that might have been 95, 96 as well. But I mean, maybe that's kind of history rewriting itself. But you've got, in terms of a player who I'm going to throw in there, I mentioned 4, who are moments. Was he as good as Dwight York? Probably not. Was he as good as Dublin? They're different types of players, so you can make your point. But in terms of memories, I could name 4 straight off the bat for who I'm going to throw in. And we're going to probably talk about him in more detail in another upcoming podcast we've got on the line. So stay tuned for details of that. Dalian Atkinson, in terms of those opening few seasons, very much a Ron Atkinson striker. Scorer of Villa's first goal in the Premier League. By Ipswich, trivia fans, you might like that one. Obviously, in terms of Wimbledon, probably the best Villa goal in the Premier League, you'd have to say. And, when you get an umbrella at the end, all the better. Goals against Tranmere, League Cup semi-final. I mean, we've talked about that quite a few times. Also scored in the final against Man United, where we won. You look in terms of the numbers, the goal scoring record, kind of overall, I think it was like 25 and 85. It's okay. It's, 1 every 3.5 games. But I think those moments kind of elevate Atkinson more. And, I think in terms of, and we're just going to focus on the playing side of things. But in terms of those moments, those magic moments, I certainly associate Atkinson a lot more than I do York. And so I would have him up there for consideration. And because I inadvertently let the name slip, I suppose I should probably mention him just in case, to disappoint him. Dean Saunders, again with a partnership with Dalian Atkinson. Big money signing from Liverpool. We had a few of those kind of going down the years in terms of centre forwards. But he was scoring goals for Liverpool. It was seen as a bit of a coup for us when we got him. And obviously scoring 2 on his debut against Liverpool. I mean, that's a game that gets remembered. I mean, it's probably not quite the number 1 home game against Liverpool now in people's minds, but, it was certainly a good memory for us at the time. And, he did score goals in the League Cup final run along with Atkinson. I think he scored twice, I think, the final. Then, in terms of, he was in a struggling team. Like, funny enough, in terms of goals, I think it was his best goal scoring records. But Brian Little comes in, wants a new approach, kind of swept out with the kind of seen as the old, in with the new, really, for Brian Little. And then, kind of off he went fairly quickly, and really in terms of almost brushed under the carpet a little, I think, in terms of Villa history. Just because I suppose in comparison with Atkinson, I think he scored more goals than Atkinson, but Atkinson had those more showy moments. So he would be my 4th in the 4. I wouldn't put him as my number 1. I mean, in terms of obviously we could talk about loads of strikers, as you mentioned. There's only one who isn't in my top four, one who gets mentioned quite a lot by Villa fans negatively. But I do think, looking back, is somebody who was just in the English game too soon, really. I think if he would have come 10 years later, I think he would have... I don't think he did a bad job, kind of. I mean, we talk about leaving under a cloud. Savo Milosevic. Fans of a certain age will remember the nickname Savo Milosevic. But he scored in a cup final as well. He had moments. I don't think it was too bad. It was just an expectation at the time of it doesn't matter in terms of coming to a country where you can't speak the language or haven't played there before or don't know anything about the game. You're just going to score straight away. And if you can't, then that means you're terrible. So I think there would have been more patience even 10 years later. Unfortunately, the way things ended meant he isn't very fondly remembered either in terms of an altercation with the fans, shall we say. But yeah, I mentioned Savo not because of thinking that he would be anywhere near the top in terms of quality, but just somebody who might have been, and, kind of, we're talking about the first decade here. Whether he would have been around in the third decade, maybe his run at Villa would have been different.
Yeah, I think, all those strikers that you mentioned there have had moments that have got you on the edge of your seat. I'd argue that Dwight Yorke is one of the most exciting strikers that I've seen down at the Villa. You think of his twisting and turning runs to get past the Tottenham defence when we won 2-1 against them around Christmas, and he hit that shot across Walker. Paul McGrath scored earlier in that game, and of course he made it into our ultimate team already. Dwight Yorke scoring the Panenka penalties not only against Sheffield United, but also against Arsenal, past David Seaman at the time. The goals he scored against Liverpool in front of the standing Holt End, in particular that diving header, and the fact that he scored in the League Cup final as well when we beat Leeds. He was a big name player for us, and 12.6 million at the time seemed like a lot of money for him. I completely agree with you in regards to how he's seen by Villa fans at the moment. How he thinks he can just walk into a job is beyond me. He really needs to go and do a Sol Campbell, I think, in that regard. Jack Grealish could learn a lot from the way that Dwight Yorke's conducted himself after leaving. Also, moving on to the others, Dalian Atkinson had some great moments as well. You mentioned the goals against Tranmere, the League Cup final goal against Man United. He scored a blinding goal against Man United in a 2-1 defeat at Villa Park, where Lee Sharp bagged a couple against us. Funny enough, a Villa fan as well. There was the Dalian Atkinson run against Tranmere Rovers right at the death, where he played a 1-2 off a defender and then just had his shot saved or put wide. I can't remember off the top of my head. And then Dino scored some great goals too. The halfway line goal against Ipswich, scored some big goals for us, as you mentioned, on his debut against Liverpool as well. That's always going to endear you to the fans. Savo definitely was before his time. He was probably a number 10, wasn't he, really? One of those strikers now, a deep lying forward, if you're playing Football Manager. He was probably more suited to Parma and the Italian game that he went on to eventually join after leaving us. Apart from those players, and I think we hit the nail on the head with the top four, really, for that era. You look at a couple of others. One who really should have done a lot better than he did, and that was Stan Collymore. Yeah, he scored a couple of great goals, but for a Villa fan, he never lived up to expectations. And then two that I really think fly under the radar. One of them, Tommy Johnson, did quite well, scored quite a few goals for us. Interestingly, he was only ever sick on the pitch once, but I think most fans...
Only once.
Only once. I think most fans thought he puked up on the pitch all of the time. And the other one, who really does not get the credit he deserves, scored the opener when we beat Arsenal 3-2 and scored quite a few goals before moving on and having quite a long professional career, really.
Yep.
Julian Joachim.
Yep.
He's a good, consummate professional. If he was in the Villa squad now, would he be in ahead of Ings and Watkins? No, he wouldn't. But he'd be in ahead of Archer and he'd be in ahead of Wesley. Great guy for the club, really. But we've mentioned our main ones. The tricky part now is narrowing that down to 2. Are we gonna go for 6 again, then break it down to 4 for when we put it to the Twitterverse and also do our own decisions?
Yeah, I'd say let's do that. I mean, in terms of Joachim, I agree. I think he was like he was a better version of somebody who we're probably going to talk about next. So I'll put a pin in that. Then in terms of Tommy Johnson, kind of underrated. They're only there a couple of years, but part of a team where things were beginning to turn around. So we got to narrow this in terms of 2 for this decade. Well, we've got the top. Well, I defined my top 4. I would take Saunders out, I think. So you got 3 left. So we might have a bit of a squabble about who we're going to put in, because who I would have in terms of, I'm going to do it slightly different to get to my final 2, and then we'll knock it about. In terms of if I was coaching a team, who I would pick to play my team, who I'd want, kind of leading the troops out, kind of from the front, as it were, out the remaining 3, who would I have? I'd have Dublin. In terms of who I'd rather watch, which is different, I'd rather have Atkinson, which does leave York out in the cold. So I'm going to leave it to you, because I know in terms of not having York would be a controversial call this early on. In terms of York Atkinson, who was consistently, you'd probably say York was better at providing consistent performances. So we got those 3 knocking around. I'd probably say in terms of, I think we both have Dublin in our top 2. I would hazard a guess.
Yeah, definitely Dion Dublin. For the reasons that you said, the consummate professional, the leader of the line. You could put the armband on him. You don't even need to put the armband on him to know that he's going to lead by example.
Yep. So do we go for more consistent quality or those moments of brilliance? Which side of the fence we're going, York or Atkinson?
For me, if I think about it like this, I'm pushing for the Premier League title with this team. Whilst I want the fans to enjoy themselves, I'm quite happy to grind out 1-0 wins. And I'm therefore going to look at the player who's the most prolific, really. So for me, it's got to be Dwight York. Atkinson had some great moments, as we mentioned, but Dwight York was a prolific goal scorer for those couple of seasons. I mean, you mentioned he got 40-odd goals in the one. It's got to be him that you look at, really, as a striker. And I think most fans, and whilst I appreciate we're going to put this to a fans vote as well, I think most would say that if you could have a Dwight York in your prime now, playing as he did for the Villa then, and an Atkinson playing as they did then, scoring the amount of goals, it would be Dwight York who would break into Europe for you over Atkinson. That's my take on it.
Yep, in true Room 101 style, you convinced me. I'm happy to second that vote for York. So in terms of our 90s, early 2000s picks, we've got Dwight York and Dion Dublin. Moving on then to the second decade, from 2002 to 2003 until 2011 to 2012. We're going to have a few names floating around. Some are cult heroes. Some are players who one or both of us have a special affinity for. I teased you last time and you sidestepped me. So I'm going to go first this time, to go straight in. This was probably, in terms of, even though there was a very good team. In terms of top quality, real strikers, it was a bit more difficult this one than the 90s. I mean, we're still going to have plenty to put to the fans' votes, but I'd probably say in terms of overall for this decade, you've probably got a top 3, I'd probably say. And I'm going to go for one of those front 3 first.
Only a top 3?
Yeah, I got 3, really. I mean, there's a few others who, for various reasons, had some quality performances and seasons. But in terms of my real consideration for the final 2, I've kind of got it down to 3. So I'm going to go into one of mine in that top 3, as it were. And to be honest, I don't think I quite appreciated him at the time, but I think as as the seasons have passed, literally and weather wise as well, I think reputation has kind of increased in the Villa fans. And again, also we mentioned fans leaving, with players leaving the right way, wrong way, in terms of players coming back and still saying the right things in respect to Villa. This player has, and he's still a well-respected player amongst the fans, really. I'm going to go with John Carew, straight in there, in terms of, he's got a song.
Yeah.
I mean, wow. Rumours, he's bigger than me. I'm not sure if he's bigger than you. And we'll have to get you in a lineup. But yeah, it was one of those players who I remember at the time when we signed him, I wasn't overly convinced. And then in respect of, he was up front with another player who we'll probably no doubt talk about. And it was a functional forward line, I think. I mean, in terms of, it was overshadowed by the midfield, really, I think, in terms of you're looking for the quality midfield, and then maybe the defence second, actually, if you're looking at it. But in terms of his contribution, his commitment, desire, really, somebody leading the line, as it were, similar to Dublin in terms of his role. Yes, maybe a spoiler alert for where we're going later. I probably wouldn't put him quite as good as Dublin. But in terms of the numbers, they're not bad in terms of somebody who you don't really remember scoring very many goals. In terms of, his full seasons, Villa 13, 15, 17. So, I mean, the 17 was where we played more games because we got to a cup final. But yeah, consistent in terms of his output and a good partnership up front. And yeah, in terms of the decade, I said I found it a struggle to finger some players. And also I wanted to avoid somebody who famous last words, I think you're definitely going to pick. So I wanted to leave the floor open for that. But ahead of that main course, what are your thoughts on John Carew?
Carew was on fire a lot of the time, wasn't he, as the song goes? I mean, for any player to have 2 songs about them, they got to be a fan favourite, and they're certainly the talk of the Trinity favourite. John Carew, you mentioned there weren't many memorable goals, really. I think the most memorable ones were probably the one that hit his back and went in. I can't remember who it was against, but I remember it hit his back. He scored a decent goal against Stoke, turning it straight over their keeper's head up. I believe it was Sorensen at the time, actually. Scored a brace against the Blues in the 5-1 win, obviously. He always seemed to be on the end of the Ashley Young crosses. Got a couple of hat-tricks for us as well, one against Newcastle at home in a 4-1 win. The hat-trick against Reading away in the Cup when it looked like we were going to go out, and we were quite worried.
Yep.
He was... I completely agree, though, in regards to he joined us from Lyon at the same time as Ashley Young, and we thought, why have we bought these 2? Oh, God, O'Neill, you've got some money and you don't really know what you're doing. Martin O'Neill knew exactly what he was doing. They were both great signings, and John Carew was an exceptional talent for us. Do I think that he was the best striker in that 10-year period? No, I don't. I think he's top 4. I think there's 4 of them, not necessarily 4th either. He could be 2nd or 3rd, but first, if you have to put somebody at number 1, number 1, it's got to be Juan Pablo Angel, and I imagine that you were leaving the floor open for me with him. Juan Pablo Angel, over the years as well, has become a striker who is synonymous with the Villa, who the fans love. He talks very well about the Villa. There was an Icons piece that the Villas did a few years ago, the season that we came up, and Juan Pablo Angel said, "I'm a Villa fan." Did he score many really memorable goals? Yeah, he did. Did he get us up on the edge of our seat as well? Yeah, he did. He scored against Coventry. He, when they got relegated at Villa Park, that's, it's his first goal as well. And it was like a huge sigh of relief around the ground when that went in. He scored that absolute beauty, probably one of the best goals at Villa Park over the last 30 years. But it was in the cup when he scored against Chelsea. If you remember, he danced past a couple of players at John Terry, who I think has had some links with us over the last few years. He scored a great goal against them, scored a beautiful goal that I've mentioned before at the Valley against Charlton. He was just a player who seemed to linger in the air, very much like Cristiano Ronaldo does now, and would get on to the end of a lot of crosses. Funny enough, I don't think he scored over 15 goals a season for us. I think on a couple of the seasons, he only really featured for about half of them, but he still got about 13 or 12 goals in those 2 seasons. And he formed quite a good partnership with another player in Darius Vassell. He was a great striker, and I think he was a complete forward, wasn't he? If you're looking at that Football Manager type of pigeonholing of strikers, he was definitely somebody who, when you had him fit and in the team, you felt that you could beat anyone or you could give anybody a game because you had Juan Pablo Angel there.
Well, you've gone at Angel from the emotional angle. I want to throw in some stats for you, and I think you might be a little surprised by some of these stats.
I want to be surprised. I want you to Cilla Black surprise me.
You mentioned kind of recollection. Did Angel score more than 15 in the season? Or we'll round up and say 16. He did once in the season where he scored that goal against Chelsea in the League Cup 2003-2004. Best season for Villa. Scored 23 over the course of the season.
Bloody hell. 16
in the league, 7 in the League Cup. And those 23 goals mean there's been 3 strikers in the last 20 years for Villa who scored more than 20 goals in a season across all competitions. He's one. 2 others who we will be discussing in the next decade. But that is an achievement, in terms of, we're talking a lot of strikers, but not that many are getting those over that magical 20 goal a season threshold. So he's one. In terms of total number of goals for Villa during his time in the Premier League era, and that is a big caveat, I know, in terms of football before 92, he's 3rd on the list in terms of goals scored, which
for the Villa.
Yeah, in the Premier League era, he's 3rd, which...
It's not bad at all, is it really, considering?
Yeah, which is... Feelings of Angel, we talked about how players have kind of gone down in history and whether they're appreciated at the time, overappreciated, underappreciated. I think Angel was underappreciated at the time. I think you look in terms of numbers, only because he had only 2 seasons where he scored over 10. Second season was actually his first full season, 2001-2002, which wouldn't fall into consideration on this side of the line, but it scored 16 in 34, 12 in the league, 4 in Europe. The rest of the time didn't break 10. The seasons, one with 9, 1 with 7, 2 with 3, and he scored 1 in his first season. So in terms of the pure goal scoring record, 2 seasons aside, I know, there were reasons in terms of injuries and by the end, not being in a very good team, really, under O'Leary. Didn't quite have the consistency But the reputation has only continued to increase as time has gone. You mentioned in terms of seen as a cult hero, and in terms of the numbers, he is up there in terms of the Premier League era. But yeah, it was saying that one season, 2003, 2004, he really kind of was that player on the edge of the seat, as you mentioned, and, you know, was responsible for a real upturn in form in the season, especially in the second half. I mean, things were dicey in terms of the league in the first half. So, yeah, in terms of, there's not that many 20, 25 goal season strikers that Villa have had in the Premier League era. So he gets in the club by that stretch of the imagination. And I suppose he was at Villa for longer than what you may remember, really. Joins kind of January 2001, stays until, I think it was the summer of 2007, six and a half years. That's a decent stint. I mean, you kind of, I personally, I forgot he was there that long. So, you know, kind of testament to the longevity. But yeah, in terms of, obviously talks about the club the right way afterwards and is appreciative of Villa in terms of what we offered. I mean, he went back to America and actually had a pretty decent run, actually, in Major League Soccer for the New York Red Bulls. So, yeah, I think he's definitely deserving of that place in the top echelons of this decade. And mentioning in some of the stats in terms of goals scored in the Premier League.
Well, let me give you just really quickly, sorry to interrupt you, another stat for Angel, which is nothing to do with his goal scoring record. But he's another striker who had 2 songs. You know, so obviously a fan favourite. I realise that you're probably there thinking, you just cut me off to tell me that there were 2 bloody songs about Juan Pablo Angel, one of which I've already mentioned to you. The other one pointed out to me on Twitter, and I completely forgot about it, probably because of how old I was at the time. Juan Pablo Angel, you are the love of my life. Juan Pablo Angel, I'd let you shag my wife. That's how much the Villa fans loved him.
Well, we'll see if that's ever put to the test kind of at one of these reunions. But in terms of our pick for the 90s, you got 2 songs you're in. It seems, I mean, we'll do the formal vote a bit later, but it sounds like Angel's in because he's got 2 songs. So we may have to move swiftly on to somebody who hasn't got, well, he may have 2 songs. You know, kind of, he's got at least 2 of certain things. But in terms of who is second on the list, in terms of goals scored for Villa in the Premier League year across all competitions, most closely associated with John Carew, partner in crime, I would say.
Yeah.
Gabby Ogbonnahor, 74 in 284. So somebody whose contribution to Villa cannot be solely or arguably even predominantly measured in goals. Yeah. I'd say, in terms of goals, the most productive time I'd say was with John Carew. But yeah, there's just so much other stuff with Gabby Ogbonnahor to get your head around in terms of how he goes down in Villa history. I'd say, you know, we're mentioning in terms of the 4 for this decade, he is there in mine.
Is he? Yeah, he would be for me as well. I mean, Gabby Ogbonnahor, is he a Villa legend? He's a Villa legend for the goals he scored against the Blues, scored against West Brom, but is he really, really a legend, or is he a cult hero? You know, that's maybe a topic for another day. But Gabby Ogbonnahor, you're on the run. Gabby Ogbonnahor, you probably bummed my mum. Probably would have been a good song for him if he needed a second one. But, you know, as the song goes, he was fast. He started off very much as a winger, didn't he? In that 4-3-3 with O'Neill, when Angel was the focal point. Beat Reading 2-1 at Villa Park, I remember. Barry and Angel scoring in that match. Gabby on the right, Luke Moore on the left-hand side. Gabby was definitely a player who had us on the edge of our seats. The hat-trick against Man City, the goals, as just mentioned, against the Blues, the winning goal against Man United back in 2009, paving the way for the likes of Courtney Hawes. He was a player that, in his earlier days, you put the ball at his feet and you let him run at someone, you felt like he was going to go around them and you thought he'd score. he scored a vital number of goals. As you mentioned now, he's our all-time top Premier League scorer. And will anybody ever score more goals than him in the Premier League for us? Probably. You know, you've got the likes of Archer and Barry and those coming through. But he's definitely someone who the Villa fans love for not only his goals and his performances in his earlier years, but also for his hatred of the Blues. I think it's definitely fair to say with Gabby that he found his way into the team by luck because of the number of injuries that we had, but he scored on his debut against Everton, and he did very well from there on for the first few seasons. But towards the end of his career at the Villa, he was somebody who, unfortunately, I think the fans started to turn against. And it takes you to the quote from the Dark Knight Batman movie, which I know you saw. You can be a hero, but you can live long enough to turn into the villain. If you're around to, he wasn't exactly that, because that would have been a rubbish line for a movie. But those sentiments, maybe if he'd have left a bit sooner, people wouldn't associate that relegation season with him, the fact that he couldn't really run when we went into the Championship. Steve Bruce put him in the team when we drew 1-1 with Hull on the first game of the season, and people were thinking, what are you doing playing Gabby? Yeah, he scored, but towards the end he tailed off a bit. But he did a lot more good, really, didn't he? It's not the same as a Dwight York where you think, oh, yeah, he was great. But no, Gabby Agbonlahor was a real fan's favourite, and he was a player that you used to enjoy watching as well, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of that partnership with Carew, I mean, it was the hold-up player and the guy with pace. And yeah, I mean, the numbers demonstrate that the early part of his Villa career was definitely the most successful. I mean, he got a few caps for England, and it was a bit, it was almost a bit sad seeing him at the end. I mean, he clearly wasn't fit or in the shape that we needed him to be, or that he wanted to be. He wasn't his last game. I remember we brought him on as a sub against Blues, just based. The only reason he is because he was Gabby Agbonlahor. He was in no shape at all, and I think he just ran. I think he literally just ran into someone and got booked like after about 2 minutes of coming on. But in terms of cult hero, yeah, it definitely is the first chapter in terms of cult heroes. In terms of just for those goals against the Blues alone. I mean, in terms of I don't think this is entirely fair comparison, but you've got Shola Amiobi at Newcastle, who just always scored against Sunderland, but, wasn't doing too much else otherwise. Agbonlahor did a bit more, I think, than Amiobi, especially in that first half of his Premier League career for Villa. But yeah, just in terms of scoring against the Blues, I think alone gets him into consideration, but he did do a bit more, and he was part of that team that, under O'Neill were challenging for Europe and challenging for trophies. And I do think it was an important part of that. But yeah, unfortunately, kind of near the end, reputation did take a bit of a battering. But I would have him in the top 3 in terms of strikers for that decade. But you mentioned you have a top 4. So who have you got at your 4th spot or in that top 4 mix?
I do have a top 4. Whether this person would make it in ahead of those 2, I don't, or ahead of any of those 3, maybe not. But he's the type of striker who would guarantee you a goal when he played. And we bemoaned the fact that we got him probably a year later than we would have liked. And that's Darren Bentz. Darren Bentz, when he was actually in the team, he was prolific. He scored on his debut against Man City, scored a couple of goals against Arsenal in a 2-1 win before. He was a good player. He obviously had to go into the bomb squad at some point because of whomever else. But I think that Darren Bentz was a great striker, and I think if you had him in his main form that he joined the club in, and you put him into the team now, that he'd probably get in ahead of one of Ings or Watkins. But is he better than Carew, Gabby, or Angel? Maybe better than one of them. But yeah, just someone for consideration. What do you reckon about Darren Bentz?
In terms of that first half season where he comes in, hits the ground running, 9 in 16, brought in really just to make sure we didn't go down, and job done. It was a shame in terms of Darren Bentz that he, just because of what was going on off the field, he wasn't able to get a consistent run of managers and in a consistent team. I mean, he was at Villa for, kind of not maybe 3 seasons in total, kind of if you put in 2 halves together. I would have had 3 different managers, different kind of ratings of his ability. It's a shame, as you said, that we didn't get him when we did. In terms of, it was a sad way to end his Villa career. I mean, in terms of when you were looking in terms of Darren Bent couldn't get in the Villa team, but Grant Holt could. I think kind of, under those Lambert days, that something has not gone right there. And it's one of those situations whereby if it was he left Villa and then got a club somewhere else and then just started absolutely banging it in, then yeah, maybe that amplifies the mistake. I think the fact that he didn't really do much after he left Villa. I mean, I think when he joined Derby on loan 2014-15, he scored 10 and 15. That was kind of the last kind of hurrah of Darren Bentz. I mean, he scored 10 a couple of seasons later, but really it was kind of fits and spurts after he left Villa. I think it's only that reason why Darren Bentz at Villa isn't kind of investigated more as a failure. I say failure. I don't mean a failure of Darren Bent, really. I mean a failure of the club, that we were able to have that level of striker in and just ruin him, really. I mean, in terms of we should have got a lot more out of Darren Bent, and that is not entirely his fault, I would say. I think that's decisions of the club for the players and the managers around him. And I think it's a real shame that we didn't have those seasons that we thought we were going to get when we signed Darren Bent. And I suppose you look in terms of, you're looking at his career kind of in total, really. I mean, 2 seasons at Charlton, 2 at Spurs, 2 at 1.5 at Sunderland. Then, I suppose you look at it, it was always a player that was moving around and maybe would have benefited from just staying somewhere for a while. But unfortunately, staying at Villa for all those reasons that were going on was never an option. So a great shame, I'd say, with Darren Bent. I think for his record, doesn't warrant for me kind of that consideration into the final 2, but it really could have been. And, I think that is a great shame, because I think in terms of quality at their prime, I don't think we've had many strikers who've matched him, really. It was just a too brief, a tantalising glimpse. And I think that's a real shame. But, I'd give him a ticket to our Ultimate 11 game. You show him around the stand, make sure he had a nice bit of lunch kind of sorted. But and unfortunately, I wouldn't get him into the final consideration, unfortunately. Though we threw the name in, he hasn't made it into either of our kind of top consideration. But in terms of, a player who came through the youth system, got an England call up, had his moments, Darius Vassell, local lad, you always like to see those come through. What your thoughts on him, apart from those not in your top 4?
Darius Vassell, yeah, he like Angel had a good half, maybe a good season at one point. He was a very fast player, he's a very intelligent player. I remember Dion Dublin saying about how intelligent of a player he was and what a good player he was as well. He probably didn't realise how good he was, but for me, he wouldn't make that top before, unfortunately. He went on to Man City. He did decently there when they were just at the start with Boyanov and Petrov and Jovetic and all those sort of players. But no, unfortunately for me, Darius Vassell doesn't make it in. I think you've got more of a shout, actually, probably for maybe even an Emil Heskey ahead of Darius Vassell. And, well, we're not recording in the same room, so I imagine that you potentially had a silent chuckle to yourself when I mentioned Emil Heskey. He wasn't a prolific goal scorer, but he was a workhorse. He was an O'Neill signing. He was a different version to Carew, wasn't he? At the end of the day, he came in towards the end of Carew leaving. When Heskey joined, there was very much, what's the point in buying him? He won't score for about 5 years. Scored on his debut against Portsmouth in a 1-0 win. But then again, he wouldn't make it into my consideration. There were a few other players as well who have done well. One player who's done well elsewhere, and that was Peter Crouch. He's done very well on his podcast, but he did well when he left, going to Liverpool and really making a career for himself, going to Portsmouth as well, Stoke, and getting round teams. And like Bentz, Kevin Phillips, only 4 goals. There was a lot of promise when he joined, especially after how well he'd done at Sunderland. The only other striker who probably makes it out of that period with any sort of positive vibes around him is Marcus Allback, who scored a couple of crucial goals for us and kept us at one season with a winner against Sunderland. But I think for me, Angel, Gabby and Carew are the 3 that you narrow it down to.
Yep, I'd have to agree there in terms of, unless there's a late surge of interest from Milan Barros, then I think we have our final 3 kind of sorted. My only comment about Vassell would be, and it's a stupid comment, but there's a few of these in our podcast. Probably the worst thing that happened to him in terms of his Villa career was getting called up for England. It really then ended up being, you only turn it on for England, which I don't think was true. But it's a lot of pressure playing for England. And I think in terms of maybe his style of play, that being front and centre wasn't as well suited. I mean, 2004 Euros, he missed the last England penalty. That gets forgotten, really, which is good news for Vassell. So sorry for mentioning it on a internationally renowned podcast.
It's because he didn't do a Pizza Hut advert afterwards. That's why. He was sensible.
Yeah, well, I didn't get a lifetime supply of pizza, but yeah, apart from that,
sensible.
No,
not so sensible.
That's kind of it, really. So you've got Angel in for your final. I'm going to say your final 2 consideration. I'm going to hazard a guess for this decade. So I think that leaves us Carew or Agbonlahor, really, in terms of deciding who the second choice is going to be for this decade. I think it's a close one because they were a partnership and they complemented each other very well. Just because of longevity, I'm going to go for Agbonlahor, and also because I don't think either Carew or Agbonlahor are going into the final 2. So I don't need to spoiler alert for the fans. I don't think I need to deliberate this one too long. So I'd go Gabby in terms of my 2 for this decade.
Neither, to be honest with you, as much as for the same reason you said, neither of them are going to get into the final 2 for me. But I'll play the game, and I'll go with one of them. And I think for longevity again, I'll go with Gabby for the moments as well, for the exciting moments that he brought to us. So Juan Pablo Angel, hands down, and then Gabby Agbonlahor using his pace to nip in there ahead of John Carew.
Yep, there we go. So we've got our 2 for this decade, Angel and Agbonlahor, which leads us nicely on to the final decade, 2012-2013 to 2021-2022. In terms of a concept we may bring out in the future, in terms of the worst Villa 11. This decade has plenty of contenders in terms of strikers. So we'll try and avoid those because, ones where we're stealing our ideas for future. And two, I think, any positivity may quickly disintegrate and we are so close to the end. So I'd say in terms of, this is one of the periods whereby the lone player rule comes into effect, because probably two you might put up there are disqualified by default. So I'll mention those when we go on. I'd say in terms of this decade, there's only really one choice for me, and that's Christian Benteke. In terms of, I mentioned there were 3 players who'd scored more than 20 goals for Villa in a season last 20 years. He is one of the other 2. We mentioned Angel. And I think in terms of the sign of when he was on form, he was a great striker. And I would use that word great when on form, which is a massive caveat with Benteke. When he was on form, he's the type of striker, and who you want, really. Your ideal striker is somebody who walks on the pitch and the opposition are going, oh, shit, not this guy. In terms of you're almost beaten before you're kind of done, and, him towering over, for another header. Or, he was better with his feet than I think people give him credit for. Some great finishes, from the edge of the box. Yep. With Benteke, when he walked on the pitch thinking, oh, I'm beat, the performances really kind of suffered, I think. So he was very inconsistent, partly because of having to play, some of that season with Paul Lambert, who wouldn't play him kind of by the end. And I think it was Lambert leaving Benteke on the bench against Hull, which got Lambert sacked, which was, with apologies for Benteke missing the game. I think he did it for the greater good, Benteke, to get Lambert out. But we know in terms of when he did come in, obviously the early days of Lambert, potent finisher. Sherwood got, the best out of him, just the arm around the shoulder. It works, in terms of, that run in the team. But yeah, a striker to be feared, really. And I'd say we've talked about, lots of good strikers so far, but I wouldn't use the word feared about any other one apart from Benteke on top form. So for me, I would definitely have him for this decade. I think it's a real shame in terms of, you can understand why he left to go to Liverpool. I think it was just a sense of an old-fashioned transfer. He had a great game against Liverpool, so Liverpool decided to buy him without any real thought of how he was going to play in Liverpool's team. So he struggled at Liverpool, but I don't think that was really his fault. I think it was a poor signing by Rodgers because he just had no concept about to play him. And then unfortunately, most of his time at Palace has not been great, although he did have a renaissance of sorts last season. I think he got 10 in the league, which was his best for a considerable period of time. But record at Villa in terms of, it's kind of their 3 seasons in the league: 19, 10, 13, overall 23, 11, 15, 49 and 101 appearances, 42 and 89 in the Premier League. Yeah, for me, he is number 1 for me for this decade.
Well, for 1 in 2 goal ratio, it's hard to argue, isn't it, really? I think that the amazing thing about that as well, and I do really feel that a lot of Villa fans forget this, is that in the first half of each season, he was a flaming pile of garbage. I think he scored about 3 goals or 4 goals before Christmas in his first season after scoring on his debut against Swansea. And then he was on fire. He scored a load of goals. He did the same the second season. I can't remember if it's because of injury or whatnot, but he didn't score too many. He destroyed Liverpool in that 3-1 win when we were in those lovely lime kits. Him and Andy Vyman really took the game to them, but didn't score too many before Christmas and then scored a load. As you say, it got to the point with him where I actually thought that Lambert did the right thing in dropping him because he wasn't scoring goals again going into that whole game. But Sherwood came in, put his arm around him. Benteke returned the faith by scoring a penalty winner against West Bromwich Albion at home. We were on our way back from playing football that night, if you remember.
Yep.
It was a 2-1 win. He destroyed Liverpool in that FA Cup semi-final. One of the best centre-forward displays I've seen for the Villa. Him, Delphin, Grealish scored some great goals for us as well. The one in the 1-1 draw against Man United at home springs to mind, but he was very much a colossus. He was a force to be reckoned with. A great striker, more so than anybody else within that period. And for me, there was only one of a name for serious consideration. However, he's only had one season for us. And then there was another player who was there for a few years, but only did it over one season. So I'll go with that player first, and that was Jonathan Codger. Yes, it was in the Championship. 19 goals in the league after joining us before transfer deadline day. He didn't join at the start of the season, otherwise he may have got to 20. Unfortunately, broke his ankle away at Blackburn. He was somebody as well in that Championship side who, on his day, you felt would win and would terrorise defenders. Unfortunately for him, I think Brucey rushed him back too soon in that second season because he got injured again. And then when he came back for that third season, of course, one of the loanees, who I'm sure you'll discuss a bit more, Tammy Abraham, overtook him as the main starter. And Codger really had to make do with bit part roles out on the wing and trying to get into the team that way. It never suited him. And he eventually left. I think the most noticeable thing he did in that season really was wave at Chris Brunt in the playoffs when he got sent off. Catch it on telly. It's quite funny.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of near the end, I also remember he scored against Liverpool in the League Cup when Liverpool played the under-12s. But yeah, I'd probably have him second in the decade, really, which I think kind of sums up what the decade is. You mentioned him, Tammy Abraham, doesn't qualify because he was only on loan. He was the third player I know you're listening out for in terms of Villa players that scored more than 20 goals in the season. He was number 3 in that list. And the only Villa player to score more than 25 in a season in the first since I think it was Andy Gray. I'm sowing the seeds. We may have something special in relation to talking about that in a bit more detail coming up. But in terms of that season for Abraham, yeah, I mean, funny enough, in terms of somebody who scored like 25, 26 goals, he had a few dips kind of during that season for recollection. But yeah, I mean, real crunch player when you needed him. Playoff semi-final, penalty shootout. For reasons I'll elaborate on in probably another podcast. I don't remember too much of this, but he did score the winning penalty from what I'm told. So you got to give the guy, stepping up when it matters, you got to give him credit for that. And also just in terms of, that goal scoring record, fantastic in terms of that
scored
season.
2 winning penalties against West Brom in that season because he scored in the first leg, didn't he, when we won 2-1 at home? And then, yes, he did score. I can remember it. But yes, scored that winning goal. Tammy Abraham was a great player, and I think we'd have welcomed him back with open arms at the start of the season, and maybe we'd have seen Ings and Abraham up front. But regrettably, he's gone on to Roma. He's doing quite well over there from what I've seen, though I could be wrong because I've only seen about 1 or 2 games.
Well, he's got a call up to the England squad.
Wow, it's not too bad.
Nope.
I think the only other player from that period, realistically, that you can look at is Ollie Watkins for that superb first season that he had for us in the Premier League. But it's one season in the Premier League, and this season for him is going to be where the big questions are answered because that second season syndrome got off the mark on Sunday against Tottenham with his goal. But Watkins, I think he surprised a lot of people. It certainly surprised me. I thought he was a lot of money. I didn't think he'd do much for us. I thought, oh God, we need a proven striker. He's proved me wrong.
I think with Watkins, you needed to hit the ground quick, and he did in terms of getting that hat-trick against Liverpool early on. that really settled him down and was really the basis for, as you said, a very good first season. There's only really two other names I want to throw in there. One who doesn't qualify and one who does. So neither of them, spoiler alert, are probably getting into the final two. Andy Weimann, when times were bad, where he scored a couple of goals. There was talk of him being linked with Inter Milan. Looking back, we should have taken the money if it was ever a serious consideration. But yeah, he came through the youth system. Did all right. He's still playing in the Championship. So, he's got himself a decent career. So fair play to him for that. The other player doesn't qualify because he was on loan. Somebody who, continuing the theme, who when we signed, I thought, oh God, what we got this guy for? I'm not convinced he's any good at all. And he fitted into the team really well. He was only there for half a season. He fitted in because he was just, along with another player who we've talked about in I think it was the Right Midfield podcast, just one of those hard-nosed bastards that you need, really. Get stuck in. Not afraid to put the foot in, but with quality. Lewis Graben, in terms of that half season when he was on loan, I mean, he was at Sunderland for the first half of the season and, kind of ruthlessly left them because he realised that was a sinking ship. Goes back, gets the loan move to Villa, scores, decent number of goals. And in terms of, do I think he was good enough for the Premier League? No. So in terms of if he would have got promoted, I think he would have been, a slightly sadder end because I think we would have bought him if we would have gone up because we would have thought we would have had to. So that brief kind of affair, I remember seeing him away at Sheffield Wednesday when we won 4-2. And I thought he played, I think he scored, really got involved, bit of argy-bargy. That's what you need, in terms of that level at the Championship. So in terms of strikers for the last decade, he's probably fourth kind of on the list, which, in terms of the number of, average terrible strikers we got, that's a whole podcast in itself. So we will leave that. So we've got to get
scored against the Blues at the weekend as well, didn't they?
Yeah, didn't he? This might just
Forest,
be putting two and two together. Did he score for Forest like when it was 5-5 when we were in the Championship? I mean, I don't know if he was there.
Scored a couple. Yeah, a couple.
Yeah, I think strikes me something you'd do.
We'd have taken him that Championship season as well, wouldn't we? If Dr. Tony hadn't have blown he didn't blow all our money because he never had any money to begin with. But we'd have had him then, and he'd have been a signing we'd have been excited about as well. To be fair.
Yeah, well, we had Tony Abraham, so that worked out.
It's all okay,
But you wouldn't have been too disappointed if Graben would have come back. Though, in terms of potential disappointment, we'll start with 4. Well, I don't know if we can even get to 4, frankly. I mean, we've got to get to 2. So, both for this decade, I would, just by the process of elimination, I would throw in Benteke and Codger for my 2. I'm not sure if I've missed out any other potential candidates for the final 2 here.
I would go with Benteke, but I'd go with Watkins over Codger. I think more for Codger did it before in the Championship. That's why we signed him, because he was a proven Championship player. Watkins stepped up. He hit the ground. You say he hit the ground running. I think it was his 3rd or 4th game, wasn't it? Liverpool when he scored, but he certainly hasn't looked back since then. Scored a couple of goals against Arsenal, or 3 goals against Arsenal. Scored twice against Tottenham. Actually, both the last goals he scored for us were against Tottenham away from home. He's not afraid to score against good teams. Very good striker who hopefully rediscovers his form for the rest of the season and gets a good link in with a striker who you'd hope we'd be discussing when we do this again in 5 or 10 years in Danny Ings. I had to put his name in there. But yeah, Benteke definitely, but I'd probably go Watkins over Codger.
Well, because he's done it in the Premier League and Codger didn't, I'm happy to go in with Watkins. So we've got our final 6. Dwight York, Dion Dublin from the 90s, early 2000s. Angel and Gabby from early 2000s to early 2010s. And then we've got Benteke and Watkins for 2010s onwards. So in terms of the fans vote on Twitter, we got to get 6 into 4. So in terms of knocking a couple straight off the bat, we've just talked about him. I'd knock Watkins off in terms of that final four, and I would probably knock off. Yeah, I mean, I sense due to the fact that you are our predominant Twitter provider, that Angel is going into the final four, regardless of that vote, regardless of what I'm saying. So I would play. I would probably put Wonderful over Angel, but I will bow to in terms of the final four, just because in terms of my final two, it's going to be a trick on the final two. I would set the scene. I'll play nice. I would take out Watkins and I'd go Bonlahor. So I'd have my final four: York, Dublin, Angel, and Benteke.
You wouldn't moan at having those as four strikers to choose from, would you? It'd be like Sir Alex with York, Cole, Sheringham, and Solskjaer. I think Gabby comes out for Angel. I know that Gabby did very well, but he soured off towards the end, and it's for those reasons that he'd lose out for me. Also didn't predominantly play up front, played out on the wing quite a bit as well. But he let himself down with a few of the things he did, and he's openly admitted it, but he talks lovely about the Villa as well. But for me, I think Angel had more of those moments where he had the fans on the edge of their seat. Gabby scored some big goals, don't get me wrong. But Angel, yeah, I'd go with Angel first. And if I'm honest with you, out of the four, I'd want to put Angel into the starting lineup. I'd want him to be one of those two, but I'm not sure he does make it. You made very valid points about Christian Benteke. Though Christian Benteke never did it for a full season at a time. He always started slow, but he did very, very well for us. Dwight York, you mentioned before that he probably wouldn't be one of your choices because he didn't really have you on the edge of your seat. He did for me. I think it's probably because it was my first full season that I saw him down at the Villa. He scored against Man United when we beat them 3-1 on the opening day, and I remember that game vividly because I was sat in the Doug Ellis stand and it wasn't open, sat with some builders because my granddad got us in for free. Dion Dublin, but is Dion Dublin a name when you look at those other strikers who you think, wow, yeah, get him in the team and he'll fire us up the league? You'd probably look at the other ones first. It's so hard. It's really difficult to narrow this down to two. I think it's probably the hardest out of any of the others. And I'll be honest with you, when we discussed this, I knew who my two were. It's not the case now. It's not the case now. But one of them I probably would stick with. Who are you? Who are you leaning towards with your two?
In terms of mine, there's one who I'd put in. Then it's a real kind of struggle for the other two. Well, the other three to go into the other one. So may have to have quite literally a split decision whereby I pick one, hoping that isn't the one who was your first choice, leaving for you to put your first choice in second. So we end up with a nice split. Because for me, I would probably put Benteke in for me, just because evidently, you got all those different kind of qualities and skills for the four that we've picked. We've picked kind of a real kind of eclectic mix in the kind of partnerships. I think you could kind of place some of them together in different partnerships, and they each work well, and some maybe not so well together. So, I mean, you could have in terms of picking a team, you'd have a choice between all sorts. But for me, just because of in terms of that kind of fear factor, as I said, and in terms of, it's a shame, he had a few injuries as well. It's a shame we didn't get to keep him for longer. Good on somewhere left. I would have Benteke for me. So he would be my choice. Hopefully that leaves the floor open for your first choice to slot in, and then we can go home for a nice cup of tea and a biscuit.
I'm just going to say it's Juan Pablo Angel. There you go. I've ripped the plaster off. It was, if I thought about it anymore, I'd work myself up into it. Is Dion Dublin was great when he was with us. He scored a lot of goals, but was he as prolific as we would have hoped him to have been? Was he a 20-goal a season player? Unfortunately not. He scored quite a few in that first season. Scored big goals for us as well. Dwight York really, for me, is the ultimate Villa striker. So it seems weird that I'm not picking him. Those 2 seasons, he was fantastic. But when you see it like that, 2 seasons, not 3, not 4. He played out on the right midfield a bit, didn't really do much when he joined the club. It was 2 seasons, and then he left, and he sulked about it when he left, and that leaves a bit of a sour taste in your mouth. Juan Pablo Angel nearly left the Villa at one point, but stayed, did well under the managers that he played under when they played him. Scored some great goals, was a cult hero, a fan favourite, played with some amazing players as well during his time at the Villa. And I honestly think that Juan Pablo Angel at the top of his game could get into the Villa team at the moment. I think you'd see him and Darren Bentz up front now. Ollie Watkins fans probably wouldn't be too happy. Not Darren Bentz. Danny Ings. I don't think Ollie Watkins fans would be too happy, but you think Angel in that team with crosses in from Target and Cash, nodding them down to a Danny Ings. It'd be great. He could score a goal out of nothing as well. I remember one against Portsmouth, and you had De La Cruz and Solano on the right. Ball came into him. He took a touch. He ran around the outside of about 2 or 3 Portsmouth players before hitting it low, below Shaka Hislop. He was somebody who, if he was in the team, you felt that you always had a chance of winning. Yes, you did with Dwight York. Dublin to an extent at the first. But yeah, for me, it's got to be Juan Pablo Angel. So if we're going one each, Benteke and Angel up front to complete our ultimate 11. Bosnich, Delaney, Melberg, McGrath, Staunton, Milner, Taylor, Barry, Grealish, Angel and Benteke. That's getting your top 4, surely, in the Premier League.
I think that's a pretty solid team. And we've left it with a bit of controversy for the fans to deliberate upon when we put our final 4 on the Twitter page. Go and check out the Twitter page at Talk Trinity for the votes to see who the fans decide putting in their 2 spaces up front. You know, we'll be putting obviously the podcast on Spotify. It's on our Twitter page at Talk Trinity on YouTube, also on Amazon, maybe on some other places by the time we get to listen to this. But yeah, the Twitter page is where all our action happens, all sorts of votes, all sorts of comments, mostly serious, some not. But we have reached the end of the road for our Ultimate 11. We've filled those places. Will's just read out the team. Hope you've enjoyed reminiscing with us about all things Villa over the last 30 years. And I hope you've enjoyed listening to us reminisce about events a bit closer to home in the last week in terms of Spurs and looking to the future. I mean, we've got loads of exciting things in the pipeline coming up over the next few weeks in terms of got some great interviews lined up. We got some, ideas we're going to be discussing over an adult beverage in terms of features for the podcast coming up over the next few weeks, months, rest of the season. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, thanks for listening. Hope you've enjoyed the show. Hope you survived the international break, and we'll see you on the other side with our preview ahead of playing Wolves. That's going to be a good one. We've got some Wolves fans lined up to chat, berate, depending on what mood we're in. So stay tuned for that, and we'll speak to you again soon.